powered by Ecotech.
Hey everyone, I'm Tommy and we're here at the Worldwide Coral Superstore. I'm here with Josh, the general manager today, and this is our first Q&A video where we answer the questions that you guys submitted. So Josh, let's start off with an easy one.
I like easy.
YouTube Reefer wants to know, what is your favorite coral?
My favorite variety of coral is going to be Acropora. That's never going to change. Maybe a close second, Chalice. My favorite actual coral has got to be our Whiplash Acro. It's in our 1500. It's in the lagoon in the front of the store. It really is incredible. Maybe a close second, if I'd have to say, is going to be Cloud Chaser, because it's probably one of the hottest pink corals that we have.
There's kind of like a myth that Acropora is actually really hard to keep, but what's your opinion on that?
Stability makes it not so hard. I mean, honestly, they're kind of a set and forget coral. You provide the right environment, they're actually really easy. It gets more difficult when we start doing, I think, mixed reefs. If you have an Acropora specific tank, really, really easy actually.
All right, perfect. Let's move on to the next question. Tomimoto Films asks, what's the WWC way to raise or lower alk and calcium?
Here at WWC, we use a lot of kalkwasser as the primary form of calcium and alkalinity. But remember, they're large systems, so we can go through 30 or 40 gallons of kalkwasser in a single day. But as we all know that use kalkwasser, it's not 100% effective, because if you have a lot of coral uptake, calcium reactor is kind of your backup, right? So that's what we do. We run kalkwasser as the primary focus to help keep the pH up, to help keep the alk up. But then because it doesn't keep up with the demand of the system, we keep calcium reactors on all of them. In our smaller tanks, which we also have a lot of, we use Reef Code A and Reef Code B from Brightwell. It's really easy to use. 5 mils of it is not going to kill a tank if you accidentally go the wrong route with it. So the fact of the matter, because it's not so super overly concentrated, it's great for most tanks.
I think naturally people are going to want to know, what are the levels? So what is the alkalinity range and the calcium range that you want to see in a Worldwide Corals tank?
The way we do it here is 8.3 to 8.9 is our target. Does that vary? Yes, a little bit, due to water change or, simple human error. But our guide is to stick between 8 and 9 for easy figuring. Can you keep it lower? Yes. Can you keep it higher? Yes. Has it been proven to grow corals faster at a higher alkalinity? Yes. But we choose 8 to 9 because it can go lower. It can go higher. Right? Accidents happen. And as much as we try to minimize those errors, it's that middle ground that helps, because it can go up and it can go down, and it doesn't kill coral that way.
And what do you do if your alkalinity is just a little bit too low? How do you use the Brightwell product to fix that?
In a smaller aquarium, it would just be simply upping your regular dose.
Okay.
Right? Because we want to make the most minimal change possible. So if you're already dosing, it's easier to just add a little bit more on your regular schedule. If you are trying to make a big impact, sometimes a water change actually is the easiest route. Because let's assume your alk is 7, right? Okay. And you want to be at 8.5, and your salt mixes at 8.5. We'll do a little bit bigger water change on a regular basis, right? If you're scheduled weekly to do a water change and you do 10 gallons, do 15 gallons weekly. Because then it's still the same water change schedule, but it's also a little bit more alk, right?
Right, perfect. So, and then how about, can you touch upon the calcium range that you guys use at Worldwide Corals?
Here, because of the fact that we use kalkwasser and calcium reactors, we kind of don't have much of a choice. The calcium is going to fall right around 480 parts, 440. But again, to give a target range, anything from 400 to 500. because honestly, 100 parts per million of calcium one way or the other is really not that big of a difference.
So some of the viewers might not have experience with a calcium reactor. Can you kind of give us a basic of how does that actually work?
Sure. The idea of a calcium reactor is to have a media, a carbonate source, and by injecting CO2 into the regulator, you're lowering the pH inside of the cylinder, which creates a dissolved stone, which is then soluble again for the corals to use. So it's kind of like a big circle of life. Pretend that that stone that we're dissolving is actually coral, because that can happen, and you're putting it back in a soluble form into your aquarium for the corals to use. That's really all it is. We're dissolving a carbonate source to add back to the aquarium for the corals to then use again.
So the CO2 is actually breaking down that substrate.
Crazy, right?
That's pretty mind-blowing.
It's a rock. You're dissolving a rock. So, but it's even more crazy to think of the fact that the corals, through their growth, they're actually building that coral skeleton. So the CO2 is breaking down the stone or the coral skeleton, but the coral is building it back up with the same stuff.
That's pretty crazy. And it's maintaining alkalinity at the same time?
Yeah, calcium and alkalinity are the byproduct of that breakdown.
All right, so we moved over to the farm section to answer this next question. And this one is by Mateo Holmes, and he asks, how do you make a more complete ecosystem and proper habitat for all of your tank critters? Sometimes we focus so much on the corals that we forget about making the most for our fish and inverts.
How do we create a complete ecosystem? So there's no good way to answer that, but I think the biggest thing that I consider is if our corals are happy, so is the rest of our tank. Here I don't know, you see in this tank here, there's a lot of fish that are primarily herbivorous. So they're creating that cleanup in a sense for us.
Okay.
On the bottom of the tank, there's a ton of little blue leg hermit crabs, and I'm sure we can find in the tank also a handful of different types of snails. We keep margarita snails, Mexican turbo snails, astrias, trochus, all of which are utilitarian. So I have a hard time answering that question the way that it's asked, but I think what we're looking for is, are the rest of our animals happy? And I would say 100%. We're providing them a food. We're providing them a place to live. All environmental conditions, including temperature and pH, are on point. And they're living with the same types of animals are found within the wild, obviously outside of their demographic, but they're still in a good environment. The water's not filthy. We do our water changes. We keep our alkalinity and magnesium and calcium all where they're supposed to be. So I think generally speaking, as long as we're providing a good environment for the coral, everything else follows suit.
So everything that you put in here has a purpose, is pretty much what you're kind of saying.
100%. I mean, obviously the corals don't serve much of a purpose except for looks or hiding places for the fish, or obviously sales for worldwide corals. But yeah, our focus is on the coral, but I think everything kind of follows suit, because the corals wouldn't be happy if the other environmental ideals weren't in place.
Can you tell us why you set this tank up, and then, because you kind of mentioned why you have all the critters, but what's the main purpose of this particular system?
So the corals in our raceways, they do well, but there's something about putting them into an established system, specifically a display. It's deeper, the water movement has different zones to it, the fish pick in and out differently, so we don't get algae growing on our tiles or our plugs. It's more of a natural habitat for the coral, which kind of goes hand in hand with your question, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They're going to grow faster. They're going to produce a better color, more natural growth structure. Because think about what happens in the raceway. We've got egg crate racks. The flow is the same from one end of the tank to the other. From the top of the tank to the bottom of the tank is even almost the same zone. So it's flat. Where in the wild are you finding that?
Nowhere, pretty much.
Yeah, maybe a mariculture rack. So it's not a 100% natural environment. I feel like by having the corals in the display, it's multiple purposes. They look beautiful, so it's something to look at when our customers come here to visit, which, I mean, to me, I love looking in the display tanks. 2, we've got more places, I think, by square footage for coral to grow. They're growing on the verticals, they're growing under the rocks, rather than in a raceway, they're growing flat out on a tile.
Perfect. And so for people like Mateo and our hobbyists at home, how important is it to plan out your system, plan out what you're going to put inside of your aquarium?
That's the number one. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. If you don't have an idea of what you're planning on doing before you set your tank up, do so. I mean, it's the most important thing about long-term success. If you have an idea in your head that you want a panther grouper or a clown trigger, that's going to dramatically change what the outcome of the aquarium is going to be, because you don't see them in any of these tanks.
No, not at all.
You know, if you plan on having a monster moray eel of some variety, how do you provide that ecosystem? Do your research.
All right, Josh, for our final question, we moved to the back section of the farm because Wonderwater asked, what are the minimum phosphate and nitrate levels for Xenia?
Minimum level? I don't know as if I would impose a minimum level. We keep all of our corals in the same type of environment. There are, and I'm going to explain here in a second, there are factors that allow certain things to be different. For example, we're going to talk about Xenia, Anthelia, and Cespitularia. We treat all of those the same. Because they grow so fast, we keep them in an isolated tank. That way we don't have to try to worry about trimming them from in between our other coral. But in a nutshell, you see here, we keep a very simple setup. This is just a hang-on filter. This is a, I think, 55 or a 60-gallon tank. And then in the bottom of it, there's a bunch of rubble, which is actually calcium reactor media.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. So all 3 of these tanks. So this is Anthelia, Cespitularia, and Xenia. We shoot for the same numbers, but because it's, I guess you want to call it inferior equipment, the hang-on filter, and I don't even think there's a power head. Yeah, there's a little power head, a narrow 3, and then a heater in the tank. Because it's not the best filtration, they do tend to get a little bit dirtier. We water change the same. We run the lights a little bit more white because they do look better under a whiter light rather than a blue.
Okay.
But the gravel is dirty. So there's probably a ton of muck in there if you go stirring it around. But in a nutshell, I think the phosphate levels get up a little bit higher than normal. I think if we look back at our test results, they vary from maybe 0.5 to 0.1 in that range. And then the nitrate levels, I want to say, are anywhere from 10 to 25. But it doesn't mean that we try to shoot for that higher level. It's just, this is the environment. That's what we gave it. They do better in a lower level. They do better in a higher level. So just keep it where you have it. I think the key there is, because this is what we've created for them, they are what they are and it doesn't change. So back to the whole stability point. If it's staying a certain way and the coral looks happy, keep it that way. If you're trying to target one coral, you're going to find yourself having trouble with other corals. So I think the message that I'd like to send, if there is one at all, is do exactly the same thing all the time. There's nothing wrong with keeping a nitrate level of 10, right? Most corals are going to be accepting of it. There's nothing wrong with keeping a phosphate level of 0.08 or even 0.1, which is a little bit high for most people, but as long as it's that way, it's going to be okay. We've done tank breakdowns for customers. We have some of the most beautiful colonies of coral you've ever seen in your life. And the parameters are so far out of whack, but it's taken years for it to get to that point. We were talking to Matt, one of our customers, just yesterday, and we brought corals in from him. Really nice colonies of Monopora, which is a stony, which everybody ranks as a more difficult coral in a dirty tank, but his phosphates were elevated, his nitrates were relatively elevated, and his salinity was 1.017. So,
That's a little scary.
Yeah, but the corals were gorgeous. So my point is, just give them a constant environment, treat all corals the same, and they're gonna love you back just the same. You know, look, that Anthelia is gorgeous.
So is it a common misconception that phosphates and nitrates should be at 0? I think a lot of people hear that or they read that you want to strive for a 0 number for those.
I think there's a lot of people who have done a lot of research on the subject. But for here, we don't do good with corals in a 0-0 environment. We just don't. But on the same token, in a tank that's less than a year old, if you have elevated nitrates and phosphates, you're gonna have algae and the tank is gonna be a mess. So maturity plays a lot into that factor. You know, if you try to keep a low level nitrate and phosphate in a brand new tank, and I say brand new, maybe less than 8 months, it's a struggle to keep corals really healthy and colorful. So again, back to it, keep the same environment all the time. Don't modify for one type of coral. You know, they do well in a consistent environment. It's a hang-on filter. I mean, what more basic do you get? And that's Cespitularia. Look, there's a perfect example. Look at that clam.
Wow, thriving, fully open.
So.
And so these corals that you're talking about today, they're known for growing fast and being really healthy, but some people have difficulties with them. What do you think is the #1 problem? What are they doing wrong if they can't keep one of these corals?
I think everybody wants overnight gratification. I mean, that doesn't happen. You can't just put a handful of Xenia and Cespitularia in a tank that's brand new, and you don't have your husbandry schedule laid out. You don't have a constant water change schedule or a water testing and modification schedule. Once you have those things down, all corals are gonna do well.
Well, that wraps up our first ever Q&A video. Thank you, Josh, for your time in answering the questions. If you guys didn't get your question answered, don't worry. They're probably going to be used on the next episode, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.